In the Second World War, Hitler's deadliest fantasies were rarely about single battles. They were about map-wide traps, the kind that crush an enemy before the world can even react. And in his mind, no enemy had to be crushed faster than Joseph Stalin. By the time German armies turned east, Hitler wasn't simply planning an invasion. He was chasing a closing door, a race against Soviet manpower, Soviet space, and Soviet industry. The gamble depended on speed, and speed demanded something almost impossible: that the Soviet Union be pressured from more than one direction at once. That is where Japan enters the story, not as a side character, but as the missing jaw of the trap. Hitler wanted Tokyo to strike the USSR in the Far East, while Germany hammered in from the west, forcing Stalin to defend two vast frontiers, splitting reserves, splitting rail lines, splitting attention, until the Red Army cracked under the weight of distance and panic. It sounds clean on paper, two empires squeezing one rival from both sides. But war is never paper. The central question of this story is simple, and it will decide everything that follows. Why did Hitler believe Japan would help him choke Stalin? And why did Japan, time after time, refuse to play the role Hitler assigned it? The border war Japan never forgave. To understand why Hitler's two-front trap was never automatic, you have to rewind before Pearl Harbor, before Barbarossa, back to a harsh lesson Japan learned the hard way on the Soviet frontier. In the summer of 1939, on the remote borderlands near the Khalkhin Gol River, known in Japan as the Nomonhan Incident, Japanese forces clashed with Soviet and Mongolian troops in a fight that escalated far beyond a border dispute. The Soviets, under the rising commander Georgy Zhukov, brought something Japan was unprepared to match: massed armor, coordinated artillery, and encirclement tactics executed with cold precision. The result was a bruising defeat that left Japan shaken, and the casualty figures, argued over in different records, still land in the tens of thousands when combined, with Japan suffering heavily and the Soviets paying a serious but sustainable cost. What mattered more than the arithmetic was the psychological aftershock. The myth of an easy northern advance into Siberia shattered. Inside Tokyo, the old strike north dream lost prestige, and the strike south logic, resources, sea lanes, the colonial empires, grew stronger. So when Hitler later imagined Japan lunging at Stalin's flank, he wasn't asking for a simple favour. He was asking Japan to reopen a scar it had just learned to fear. The pacts that promised unity and hid the real war. By 1940, Hitler tried to turn ideology into geometry. If Germany, Italy, and Japan stood as one, then the Soviet Union could be boxed in by the very shape of the alliance. The logic sounded firm, especially after the anti-Comintern thinking of the 1930s framed the USSR as the ultimate enemy, and it seemed to harden when the Tripartite Pact was signed in September 1940, binding Berlin and Tokyo into a public partnership. But buried inside this unity was a fatal misunderstanding. Hitler believed anti-communism automatically meant anti-Soviet war, while Japan treated agreements as tools, not destinies. And then came the reality that should have warned him: states sign pacts to buy time, not to surrender choice. Germany itself proved that in August 1939, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a stunning non-aggression deal with Stalin that let Hitler strike Poland without fear of a two-front war until he was ready to break it. Japan watched all of this, calculating coldly, and when it suited Tokyo's survival, it made its own decisive move. In April 1941, Japan signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, a clear signal that Japan did not intend to be dragged into Siberia on Berlin's schedule. In one document, Hitler's trap lost its eastern jaw before Barbarossa even began. When Barbarossa began, Hitler needed Japan to move. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, and the war Hitler had postponed became the war he could no longer control. From the first day, his entire strategy leaned on a single brutal assumption: the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, before its size, factories and reserves could fully awaken. But even as German columns drove deep into Soviet territory, the Kremlin still had one priceless advantage: space and time. Hitler understood what that meant. If Stalin could avoid a panic, if he could keep his reserves intact, if he could shift divisions along the vast internal rail network without fearing a second disaster in the east, then Barbarossa would become not a knockout punch, but a grinding test of endurance that Germany could not win forever. This is the moment Hitler's two-front dream turns into an obsession. He wanted Japan to turn its neutrality into a knife, to force Stalin to defend Siberia, Vladivostok, the long rail spine of the Far East, and the vital flow of material and troops across thousands of kilometers. In Hitler's mind, Japan didn't need to conquer all of Siberia, only to create terror, uncertainty, and the threat of encirclement. He believed that even the possibility of a Japanese strike would pin Soviet forces, crack Soviet planning, and make the Red Army bleed in two directions at once. Tokyo's choice: oil and oceans, not Siberian snow. But while Hitler saw the Soviet Far East as a lever, Japan saw it as a sinkhole, cold, vast, and strategically unrewarding compared to what lay to the south. By 1941, Japan's war planners were trapped by a different clock: fuel. Modern war ran on oil, and Japan was dangerously short of it. With American and Allied economic pressure tightening and access to resources becoming a matter of survival, the Strike South faction argued that Japan's future depended on seizing the oil, rubber, and raw materials of Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies, even if that meant a collision with the United States and Britain. Siberia, by contrast, offered harsh terrain, long supply lines, and no quick prize that could solve Japan's immediate resource crisis. And the memory of the 1939 border defeat still hovered. The Soviet army had shown it could fight Japan effectively on land, with armor and artillery at scale, exactly the kind of war Japan least wanted while its navy prepared for the Pacific. So, when Hitler imagined Japan marching into Soviet territory to help finish Stalin, Tokyo's leadership increasingly viewed that as Berlin's war, not theirs. Japan could either gamble everything in a freezing land campaign against a proven opponent, or gamble everything on a southern strategy aimed at breaking the resource noose. In the end, Japan chose the oceans, not Siberia, and that choice quietly began strangling Hitler's plan. How Hitler tried to push Japan into Siberia. Once Barbarossa was underway, Hitler didn't merely hope Japan would strike the Soviet Union. He tried to engineer it relentlessly through diplomacy that bordered on salesmanship. Berlin's messages to Tokyo carried the same pitch in different uniforms. Germany was winning fast, the Soviet system was cracking, and Japan could take advantage before the prize vanished. German officials and diplomats pressed the idea that a Japanese move in the east would not need to be a full conquest, just enough pressure to force Stalin to split his strength, to keep divisions tied down in Siberia, to turn the Soviet Union into a house fighting fires on two ends at once. In this campaign, envoys and ambassadors became weapons: the German embassy in Tokyo, the Japanese embassy in Berlin, and the steady traffic of discussions and cables all revolved around one demand: open the Eastern Front. Hitler's promises were sweeping, confident, and dangerously convenient: that Moscow would fall, that Soviet resistance was near collapse, that Japan's timing was perfect if it acted now. But behind the confidence was a brutal reality Hitler could not admit. Germany was asking Japan to take a risky land war against a capable enemy, while Japan was staring at a resource crisis and a widening Pacific horizon. The more Hitler insisted the Soviet Union was about to break, the more Tokyo calculated that Germany's urgency was proof of German dependence, and that dependence made Hitler's trap feel less like a shared strategy and more like a request born of fear. The gift Stalin didn't thank Japan for. For Stalin, Japan's refusal to strike north was not a minor diplomatic detail. It was a strategic miracle hidden inside silence, because as long as Tokyo kept its neutrality in the Far East, the Soviet Union could avoid the nightmare Hitler wanted, a two-front panic stretching from the gates of Moscow to the forests beyond Vladivostok. This mattered in the most concrete, measurable way war can matter. It shaped where Soviet divisions stood, where trains ran, and where commanders dared to take risks. In 1941, Stalin feared encirclement and betrayal from every direction, yet the eastern frontier stayed, if not peaceful, at least stable enough to calculate around. Soviet intelligence watched Japan closely, and when Moscow became convinced that Japan's main focus was shifting away from Siberia, that knowledge became operational power. It meant the Red Army could begin shifting experienced formations westward at the moment Germany expected the Soviet Union to be cracking. And as the German offensive ground forward into the autumn and winter, the Soviet state gained something Hitler could never fully see from his maps: the ability to concentrate. Hitler wanted Japan to pin Soviet strength in the Far East. Instead, Japan's restraint helped free Soviet strength to meet the crisis in the West. The trap was supposed to squeeze Stalin until he broke, yet the longer Japan stayed out, the more the Soviet Union could turn Barbarossa into what Hitler feared most: a war of endurance, where time stopped being Germany's ally and became its executioner. Pearl Harbor shatters Hitler's two-front math. In December 1941, Hitler's dream of Japan as the eastern blade against Stalin didn't just weaken, it was effectively rewritten by events Japan itself set in motion. On December 7th, Japan struck the United States at Pearl Harbor, and within days the Pacific turned into a furnace that demanded Japan's full attention. Carriers, pilots, fuel, shipping, and an entire naval strategy suddenly locked into a life-or-death contest against America's industrial weight. Hitler, still imagining the Soviet Union as a structure that could be kicked down with one more push, tried to interpret this as an advantage, because Japan's expansion in the south might cripple Western powers and free the Axis to reshape the world. But strategically, it was a trap of a different kind, and it trapped Germany's plan. Japan's war became primarily a maritime war across thousands of miles of ocean, where every decision consumed aircraft, escorts, and oil, precisely the resources a Siberian campaign would also devour. And when Hitler chose to declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, the conflict expanded into something Germany could not finish quickly, making his timetable against Stalin even more desperate. By the time 1942 unfolded, Japan was fighting for island chains, supply routes, and naval dominance. Its planners were not preparing a northern thrust. They were trying to survive a widening Pacific struggle that punished every overextension. In blunt terms, the moment Pearl Harbor happened, Japan's strategic center of gravity moved farther away from Siberia than ever before, while Hitler's need for that Siberian pressure grew more frantic because Barbarossa had failed to deliver the quick collapse he promised Tokyo in the first place. April 18, 1943. The P-38s that proved Japan was locked in the Pacific. On April 18, 1943, the war produced a scene that, without meaning to, answered Hitler's old demands more clearly than any diplomatic cable ever could. A squadron of American P-38 Lightnings racing low over the Pacific, skimming toward Bougainville, hunting Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and one of Japan's most gifted naval minds. Operation Vengeance was not a lucky encounter. It was the modern clinical warfare of signals intelligence. Decrypted Japanese communications revealing Yamamoto's itinerary so precisely that American planners could calculate interception to the minute. In the formation flew pilots like First Lieutenant Rex Barber, men tasked with a mission that was both military and psychological. Remove a symbol and you wound morale, planning, and confidence at the highest level. Yamamoto's death was meant to echo through the Imperial Japanese Navy as a message that nowhere was safe, not even the sky above the Empire's farthest front. But for our story, its deeper meaning is even colder. It proved Japan's war had become inseparable from the Pacific. Japan's best leaders, its best aircraft, its best thinking, and its most existential fears were now tied to ocean distances, island chains, and American industrial power, not to marching into Siberia to fulfill Hitler's fantasy of trapping Stalin from both sides. While Hitler still imagined Japan as the eastern jaw of a continental vice, Japan was bleeding and manoeuvring in a different universe entirely, and the sky over Bougainville made that unmistakable. When the trap collapsed, and Hitler couldn't admit it. By 1943, the truth Hitler had tried to delay with speeches, orders, and wishful maps finally became undeniable. The two-front trap was dead, and it had died not in one dramatic moment, but through a chain of turning points that destroyed the logic of his entire gamble. The first crack came when Barbarossa failed to produce the lightning collapse he promised Japan, when Moscow did not fall in 1941, and when the war turned into a brutal contest of production, winter, and reserves. Then came the deeper wound. The Red Army absorbed the shock, recovered, and began to counter-strike, while Stalin's eastern frontier stayed quiet enough for him to move forces with far more confidence than Hitler ever planned for, helped by intelligence that Japan was not preparing a northern attack. And as Germany bled in the east, Japan bled in the Pacific, increasingly trapped in a war where every carrier lost and every trained pilot killed narrowed Tokyo's options until the idea of opening a massive land campaign against the USSR became not just unlikely, but strategically irrational. In Hitler's original vision, Japan would help suffocate Stalin by forcing him to split the Soviet Union in two. In reality, the Soviet Union stayed whole long enough to do what Hitler feared most: learn, adapt, and outlast. The trap that was supposed to close from both sides never even formed its second jaw, because alliances do not obey ideology, they obey interests, geography, and survival. And so we return to the opening image. Hitler staring at a map, imagining Stalin pinned between two empires, only to discover that the world does not bend to a plan simply because one man demands it.